All right, everybody. Bit of an emergency stream. You may have heard the news that we are effectively now at war with Iran. And I don't say that lightly or flippantly or without adequate consideration. Trump launched an airstrike today that killed General Soleimani, who is the number two figure in Iran, essentially. He's the most revered military figure in the country. Imagine if the chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff in the United States was assassinated by an airstrike. But that doesn't even really fully capture the gravity of this, because most people in the US couldn't name the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, right? Soleimani was a widely recognized individual in Iran, central to sort of their self-conception. And it's difficult to even identify an accurate parallel as to what U.S. figure would be analogous to Soleimani. It's almost as though, General Eisenhower, for example, was assassinated during World War II or something like that. I mean, again, not a perfect analogy, but it's something akin to that. So that's as blatant of an act of war as you can get, targeting the senior military leadership of the country and killing him. And now we all have to revise our frame of reference here and understand that we are in a state of war with Iran. Now, there was a proxy war already raging against Iran. There were skirmishes with Iran that escalated in the past couple of years and arguably date back to 1979, right? But this is now an enormous leap, and it is fair to say that we are now in a state of war with Iran. Does that mean that we're going to send hundreds of thousands of troops overnight to Iran? No, but it could easily result in that. So people have to understand that, and they have to, again, adjust their expectations and adjust their mode of reference to account for this new fact. Now, it wasn't just Soleimani who was assassinated. It was other senior military figures, including one who was the head of one of these so-called militias that are Iranian-backed, who just so happened to get done very recently defeating ISIS. Soleimani was also a central figure in actually depriving ISIS of its territorial stronghold. The U.S., you might not know this, coordinated with Iran in the campaign against ISIS since 2014. So now, because U.S. foreign policy is such a clown show of incomprehensibly incoherent insanity, we went from tacitly partnering with Iran to combat ISIS to drone bombing the forces that were in charge of the anti-ISIS campaign in the region. And this was all manufactured by the U.S. This is a total product of insane, never-ending U.S. interventionist pathology, which says that if a band of individuals cause a bit of a ruckus outside the U.S. embassy in Iraq, which, by the way, is the biggest embassy in the world, it's hardly even an embassy. It's more like a fortress, which the U.S. established after the invasion of Iraq. So that glaring totem to U.S., you could say, imperialistic overreach draws some protest and some violence. And then the U.S. responds by killing the most senior figure in the entire Iranian government other than the Ayatollah. So imagine how the U.S. would react if something analogous happened to us. We would immediately be perceiving that as an act of war, and we will respond in kind. And that's how Iran is going to perceive this. Now you're going to have a relentless propaganda push to portray this as though it was, quote, defensive, as if the U.S. is not the one who is the aggressor by being in the region, by invading Iran's neighboring countries, by decimating Iran with sanctions, by constantly threatening to topple its government, by just last summer being 10 minutes away from launching an aggressive strike against Iran because they downed an American drone in international waters. Recall that incident when Trump had a change of heart at the last second and dialed it back? The escalations have been increasing over time such that this almost became inevitable because, of course, there was going to be some kind of incident that could be cited as a precipitating event to justify as dramatic an action as this. So I said something on Twitter which the faction of Trump supporters who followed me were not happy with, but I stand by it. If Trump launches a full-out war with Iran, now we're already in a state of war, right? So that's settled and done. It's already been carried out. But if he launches an all-out war with Iran, meaning deploys ground troops, regime change, the whole 9 yards, I will actively campaign against Trump, and I will actively support whoever his opponent is, even if it's Joe Biden, who I, under almost no circumstance, would ever vote for. But if we're now dealing with a situation where we're at war with Iran, I will revise my assumptions, and I will say that even Joe Biden must be supported in that context, and I will actively oppose Trump. So that's how grave a situation this is in my eyes. And if you followed me for however long you followed me, you probably know that I don't often countenance the more supercilious, the more hyper reactive, the more factually ungrounded criticism of Trump. That's why I often get labeled anti-Trump, because I'm critical of the prevailing ways in which Trump has been opposed by liberals, by the resistance, by Democrats, even by leftists at times. But this crosses a threshold for me. There is no way to make this align with any recognizable concept of, quote, America first. I'm sure you'll have Trump simultaneously saying, and also his boosters simultaneously saying, that they really love this incredibly escalatory act of war, but at the same time, they're also against, quote unquote, endless wars in the abstract, because it's much easier to oppose endless wars in the abstract. Everybody does. Nobody's in theory in favor of endless war, right? But when the going gets tough and you actually have to react to a tangible situation, most of the time, those who posture as being against endless war jump on the propaganda bandwagon and justify whatever the Pentagon is shoving down their throats because they're acting viscerally to the situation, and they get into their tribalistic kind of pose and try to make this seem at all rational, which it's just not in any respect. This is a manufactured crisis. Trump withdrew from the Iran deal. Which, okay, if he was just going to withdraw from the Iran deal, maybe he wants to cut a new deal, maybe he wants to take some other diplomatic approach. I don't agree with that, but fine, that's not necessarily going to result in some kind of cataclysmic confrontation. But it wasn't just that. It was the sanctions regime, which is exceptionally belligerent and unnecessary. It was the near miss in June when he almost launched war with Iran. It was the designation of the Iran Revolutionary Guard as a terrorist organization akin to ISIS and Al Qaeda, when the Iranian military had just been fighting ISIS and Al Qaeda. So you have to recognize these escalatory steps as they come in increments. And here we go. Now the escalation has reached at least its latest peak. Commenters are going to be telling me there's no war. Well, okay. Again, I ask you, if, let's say, General Mattis or the current Secretary of Defense, Esper, or again, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, or even the vice president, who some people have been analogizing Soleimani to, if they were assassinated in a drone strike by a country we perceive to be an enemy who has constantly threatened to overthrow our government, do you think our political and media class would be perceiving that as an act of war? Do you think they would be declaring that we're now at war with whoever perpetrated that assassination? Do I even have to ask the question? You know what the answer to that question is. So don't give me this. And don't tell me that a, relatively speaking, small-scale attack on an embassy, which shouldn't even be there at all, now justifies assassinating one of the most senior figure in the entire country, save for the Ayatollah. So I don't want to hear from these Trump people or these Trump adjacent people or whomever that they're still America First nationalists, that they still don't want endless war, that they're sick of spending so much resources in the Middle East. And yet they support this mind-bogglingly brazen action, which escalates beyond anything that's occurred in recent history in terms of the U.S. war posture in the Middle East, and necessitates the expenditure of more resources and probably U.S. lives, not to mention the lives of the local people. So I don't want to hear it. It makes zero sense. You're getting on board with one of the most signature, long-standing neocon projects going back decades, which is regime change in Iran, taking out the government there. Israel's been lobbying for this forever. Obama was almost bullied into going along with it in 2011, 2012. And Trump, now because he wants to prove how tough he is, I guess, and how he's not going to allow a Benghazi to occur on his watch, takes us down this path at the end of which only lies utter disaster. Now, when people invoke Benghazi, Trump has invoked it because he's saying, "Oh, this turned out so much better than Benghazi." The underlying cause of Benghazi wasn't insufficient security at the embassy, wasn't that Obama administration officials fudged some of the details in their initial public statements about what transpired. It was U.S. intervention in Libya. Do people forget that Benghazi is located in Libya? And the reason why there was a consulate in Benghazi was because the U.S., in conjunction with the U.K. and France, decided to overthrow the government of Libya. Do you recall that? So the source of that entire affair was interventionism. And that got totally lost in the partisan rancor following Benghazi because everybody got obsessed with these relatively trivial details about the precise timeline in terms of what the talking points were. Now, was there some deceit in there? Probably somewhat, although it was largely overblown by Republicans. But I lay the blame foundationally for Benghazi on Obama, but not for the reasons Republicans were saying. It was because he was the one who launched the interventionist regime change war in Libya, which led to the consulate being established, which was obviously going to invite blowback in the form of aggravated protesters or extremist groups targeting the U.S. presence there and killing the ambassador. So if you're not willing to grapple with the underlying cause, which is U.S. intervention, which has been a total disaster in every single respect, then you're not taking this seriously. You're not thinking clearly. You're allowing yourself to be propagandized. And you are betraying zero awareness of even recent history. Forget U.S. history. Just recent history. 15 years. This doesn't look like it's part of a pattern to you. This doesn't seem consistent with all the other ill-fated military endeavors this country has embarked upon, which most people tend to agree in hindsight were horribly misguided. Well, I'm telling you contemporaneously, just as I did with Syria, with Libya, with Iraq. Iraq was before I was obviously an adult. That this is another example of that. And now you have these America First, rah-rah, chest-thumping nationalist chicken hawks cheering this on as if they're ever going to be the ones who go down to the recruiting office once the full-scale land invasion is launched and volunteer. I doubt it. So if you're a Trump supporter, yeah, please explain to me how his rhetoric of opposing endless wars and wanting to reduce the U.S. foothold in the Middle East and thinking these interventionists are a mistake is consistent with this blatant, historic, frankly, act of war, which is very likely to precipitate a wider war. It's not significant. It's a farce. I said it's not significant. I meant to say it's not consistent. It's a farce. If you believe it's consistent, you are imbibing lies. Try to turn on your critical thinking skills. I know it's difficult in the heat of an emotional episode like this when you have propagandists flooding you with phony rationalizations of what's just occurred. Try to sit back, try to understand the wider implications, and understand you've been sold a false bill of goods. Unfortunately, the United States does not have an anti-war movement to speak of. That all dissipated under Obama when the anti-war movement ignored the wars that he launched or escalated, such as Afghanistan, Libya, which I was just referencing, the various other drone bombings and extralegal assassinations and so forth. So there's no sort of foundation in terms of the wider public to oppose what's being done here. And that state of things gives Trump more license than he might otherwise have to just do whatever he wants and to get the United States embroiled in another catastrophic Middle East quagmire, which I thought we all agreed was a bad idea. I thought Trump campaigned on that being a horrible idea. I remember the speech he gave on, I believe I even remember the date. I believe it was October 31st of 2016, when he was blasting, rightly, correctly, justifiably, the political establishments of both parties for selling the U.S. taxpayer and the average American down the river with these misbegotten interventions, when that money could have otherwise been spent on building up U.S. infrastructure and various other domestic needs. But now he's gone along with the neocons, Mike Pompeo, theocratic neocon deranged person, probably playing a central role here. He got rid of Bolton, which was like an extremely low bar to clear, but he cleared that extremely low bar, got rid of Bolton, but he just put in a yes man who is a Bolton protege, essentially, but a little less maybe bothersome personally to Trump. So there wasn't a whole lot of improvement there. And there's nobody really, other than a Rand Paul who's in the Senate, there's nobody really who has Trump's ear who is giving him any kind of feedback that would seem to counteract this narrative about how this is somehow America first. Maybe Tucker Carlson will give him a call. I hope so. But you're going to get the conservative media complex, Fox News, on which you probably know I appear. You're going to get all these forces, which are nominally pro-Trump, mobilizing to propagandize in favor of this. And I'm assuming there's got to be some subsection of pro-Trump people who understand the utter insanity of this. And unless your entire worldview begins and ends with being reflexively pro-Trump, maybe you should figure out how to oppose this in a smart way, in a tactical way. Now, I have people saying, oh, General Soleimani has blood on his hands. Therefore, we had to extra legally assassinate him. Please, do we have to go over this again? Did Saddam Hussein not have blood on his hands? Did Gaddafi? Does Assad not have blood on his hands? Does Donald Trump not have blood on his hands? Does Barack Obama not have blood on his hands? Does George W. Bush not have blood on his hands? Does David Cameron not have blood on his hands? Does Nicolas Sarkozy not have blood on his hands? Does Kim Jong-un not have blood on his hands? Should we extra legally assassinate them all? Is that the operating premise we're going on? Really? That logic is the logic of fools. It's a logic of people who have been propagandized. And I'm not trying to be condescending. I hope I can rationally explain to you why that logic is the product of propagandization. But I'm asserting, with I think well-founded justification, that if that's the logic you're invoking to justify this, you are spouting propaganda. And it's most important to cut through propaganda at a moment like this, when it's being launched into overdrive, when it's being used to justify another crazy intervention, which probably people in 5 or 10 years will recognize was utter lunacy. But in the moment, they get wrapped up in the emotional furor of it all. Because, oh, General Soleimani's a bad guy. Yeah, lots of bad guys out there. Lots of bad guys running most, if not all, governments throughout human history. The point is, what do you do about it in terms of statecraft? And now we're being told that the proper course of action in terms of the deployment of U.S. statecraft is to take actions which obviously are massively escalatory. That's an understatement, and likely have drastically increased the likelihood of a full-fledged war. There is no consistency in terms of how the U.S. treats so-called bad guys. In Syria, we funded bad guys who turned out to be extremists and jihadists to overthrow the government. In Ukraine, we fund literal Nazi militias because we want them to carry out our proxy war against Russia. Trump, I think rightly, dispelled the whole bad guy label and dealt in at least a semi-rational way with Kim Jong-un for the past year and a half. Are you going to tell me Kim Jong-un is not a bad guy? I would say it's pretty rational to describe Kim Jong-un as a bad guy in certain ways, but that doesn't preclude us from engaging diplomatically with him, as Trump recognized. So don't give me this bad guy stuff. Don't give me that Nicolas Maduro is a bad guy, therefore we need to launch a coup against him. Don't give me this BS about how the Saudi royal family are bad guys, but there are bad guys, so we'll fund them and do arms deals with them and abet their total immiseration of Yemen. The bad guy thing doesn't work because you can pierce holes through it in 2 seconds if you have any basic understanding of how the U.S. conducts foreign policy. So tonight I was at a Tulsi event. I'm in New Hampshire. I've been in New Hampshire for the past couple days doing various things. I've been going to Tulsi's events, and she tonight I noticed sort of interrupted her train of thought at one point and emphasized how dangerous it is that the U.S. is on the brink of war with Iran. She wasn't asked about that per se, but she was talking about a semi-related subject and then just kind of pivoted into underscoring that warning, I noticed. And then sure enough, about a half hour later, this news crosses the transom. Interesting. I'm not going to say that she has any kind of psychic energy or whatever, but it was a little bit eerie to me to reflect on that in hindsight, that she just kind of intuited in some way that there was something going on, because this news literally broke while her event was underway. And assuming she'll have a statement out about that soon. But this reinforces my gratitude in a way, or my gladness, that somebody like Tulsi at least has some national profile and is somebody who thinks about foreign policy constantly. Foreign policy is what informs her entire approach to politics and the entire reason why she's in the race and why she's doing what she's doing. Because in order to manage a historically massive hegemonic military power like the U.S. currently has, most powerful military in world history, seems like a pretty good idea to have a president whose daily existence is sort of animated by just an organic concern for foreign policy issues. And that was sort of demonstrated in, again, an eerie way tonight, when she only found out about this event after her event concluded. I just saw a deranged commenter state that Tulsi literally advocated bombing Iran 3 months ago. No, she didn't. No, she did not. False. She's actually been sounding the alarm consistently about these escalatory actions that Trump has been taking vis-a-vis Iran. Now, I just saw a statement from Elizabeth Warren, who couched her reaction as follows. Soleimani was a murderer responsible for the deaths of thousands, including hundreds of Americans. But this reckless move escalates the situation with Iran and increases the likelihood of more deaths and new Middle East conflict. Our priority must be to avoid another costly war. Okay. Well, if that is really what our priority must be, then why in God's name are you doing anything or saying anything that would validate in any respect the underlying logic of this insane action? It's redundant to say Soleimani was a murderer. First of all, the United States is the one that invaded his neighboring countries. The United States is the one that constantly threatens to topple his government. The United States is the one that has this kind of grotesque totem to its interventionist insanity in Baghdad in the form of a so-called embassy, which obviously is going to annoy people. So it reminds me of sort of what she did with Maduro. Oh, he's starving his people, blah, 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 blah. But I have these kind of incidental strategic quibbles with how Trump is approaching the situation. That is not adequate at all. However, as inadequate as I view Elizabeth Warren to be, especially on foreign policy, if she were the Democratic nominee and Trump had launched war with Iran, I would actively support Elizabeth Warren and oppose Trump. And I do that because although it may shock you, some people do have the capacity to be consistent in their principles. I've just had trolls on Twitter denouncing me for not criticizing Obama for launching extra legal assassinations. Number one, Obama didn't launch any extra legal assassinations that are quite akin to this one in terms of magnitude, but he sure as hell launched the Libya intervention, the Afghanistan escalation, etc., and also some extra legal assassinations, bombing wedding parties, and so on and so forth. And of course, I criticized those all at the time. You can go find it. I know it's hard for many of you to conceive how somebody would criticize something regardless of which president carried it out. But for those of us who are at least nominally concerned with consistency, who have even a basic attachment to principle, I would hope that we would criticize these things regardless of who the president happens to be. Um, so you can't accuse me of hypocrisy. You can't accuse me of being a reflexively anti-Trumpster who falls in line with the latest liberal resistance obsession. I've been fighting those people. Those people have basically canceled me. They think I'm evil. They have driven me out of their little societies. So that's not my baseline. My baseline is opposition to insane interventionist policies like this. And I am grateful that Tulsi is using the platform that she has to put out a message on this stuff, which does have appeal, hopefully, across the political spectrum in terms of how she presents this type of information. I think you'll see Trump supporters who are always at her events, people who say they voted for Trump. There's always like a minority of those people at her events, finding her take on this rational. And they will come to understand that in no way is this at all consistent with a foreign policy that puts America first, that seeks to end the draining of resources in far flung conflicts. So that's what I have to say about that. Um, I've had when I was tweeting sort of animatedly about this, I had people saying, "Oh, you're so you need to calm down. You need to you're being a snowflake." Really? You shouldn't be too reactive to this. Um, no, I mean I like to think that if you follow me, you probably know that I tend to be pretty critical of liberal reactivity, even you might say snowflake tendencies. This ain't a snowflake situation. This is serious. Um, this calls for a very aggressive counteraction of the propagandistic narrative that's being put forward to justify it. And if you don't like that, if you think it's uncouth, well, that's your prerogative, I guess. But go follow Ben Shapiro's website. Go follow the many neocons who are dancing in the streets with joy about this. That's not me. That's not what I support. Go follow one of these America First grifter people who are trying to tell Trump supporters who at least ostensibly liked his seemingly non-interventionist foreign policy pronouncements. Go follow the people who are trying to convince those voters that this is a great move. That's not what I'm going to do. You'll know I opposed Hillary in 2016 because I believed that her foreign policy record was too egregious to warrant voting for her. I did not advocate for Trump either. And that's my point of view. I'm not that old, but I'm old enough to have been through a couple of these things, and they always end in disaster. And when I say these things, I mean new escalations in the U.S. deployment of military force that are justified at the time through a whole series of kind of interlocking rationales that have like emotional resonance to them if you're just kind of in the moment. But when you step back and try to use your critical thinking skills, always fall apart upon scrutiny. Um, so that's my view. Um, I would campaign with whatever anti-war movement were to form in opposition to this. If it does escalate further, I mean, it's already escalated drastically, but if it does escalate into any kind of genuine war confrontation, I mean, I almost shouldn't even parse it out that in that way because I do believe we're now at war with Iran. I think Iran has essentially declared war in response to, against us or will. Um, so I was going to oppose Trump for re-election regardless. Do not believe he at all warrants reelection. And remember, I couple that with a very critical take on the impeachment stuff. I think that the impeachment logic is catastrophically destructive in a whole variety of respects. But I'm against him being elected. And if this goes a couple steps further, I'm going to campaign against him, and I'm going to continue doing journalism. I know some people don't think that that's possible, but my philosophy has always been I'm going to be as forthright and transparent as possible with you about my views, and you can assess them for yourself. And if you don't like it, you can unfollow me or you can unsubscribe or whatever. But I like to think that there are at least some people who would appreciate a modicum of consistency. I just think it's rather pathetic for these so-called America First nationalists who, like to pride themselves on being the mortal enemies of neocons, now getting on board fully with like this long-standing neocon obsession. And central to the neocons advancing their agenda is to make Americans believe that their kind of niche geopolitical fixations are somehow aligned with the U.S. national interest and U.S. national security, which most often they are not. In fact, they undermine U.S. national interest and U.S. national security. I thought a lot of these America First nationals people understood that, but because they want to be rah-rah pro-Trump cheerleaders, they'll just parrot the neocon line. And that's foolish, but I guess understandable for people who kind of craft a worldview around nothing but support for one particular politician, in this case Trump, and around hatred for Trump's enemies. I don't think I need to convince anybody how disdainful I am of probably a majority of Trump's enemies in the Democratic Party and the media, because they've just done a terrible job, and they've even emboldened him in certain respects. But that's not going to prevent me from apprehending the reality of the situation here. I would also note, did I mention this? I'm not even sure now. It's getting late, but these are yeah, I did mention it, that these generals just led the fight against ISIS, deprived them of their territory, and now we've assassinated them. I mean, forget your moment, your kind of in the moment pro-Trump or anti-Trump reactions. If somebody just described that to you, right? If somebody just described that to you objectively, would that be in any respect a remotely sensible foreign policy? Would it even make sense? I mean, could you even like apprehend it on a basic level? Probably not. So there you go. Don't know where this is going to end, but not good. All right, people. I'm going to sign off now. Thank you for indulging me. I mean, I wouldn't call this an indulgence. I mean, I think this is a legitimate emergency stream, given the likely consequences here. I already see Lindsey Graham saying, "Oh, we got to, reposition our forces to strike back," and basically calling for all-out war. So got to be mindful of that as we move forward here. And this could not happen at a crazier time, frankly, because you have the Democratic primaries going on, approaching the final month before voting starts. You got impeachment going on, and God knows what else. So that's just going to create a insane confluence of events, and there's going to be a lot on our plate in the very short term. So If I can provide you some semblance of guidance as all that unfolds, I will do so. And if you don't like it, if you feel I betrayed you or whatever, that's fine too. But I'm gonna keep on trucking. Okay. Talk to you later.